Morehouse College's commencement was held Sunday, with President Biden giving the key address. There was some back and forth at the famous HBCU over whether students would welcome the president or if they would protest for Palestine, as we've seen elsewhere. In the end, the programme went off with only moderate disruption. Biden addressed the ongoing conflict in Gaza and the protests that have gripped many US colleges. Let's take a look.
I support peaceful nonviolent protest. Your voices should be heard, and I promise you I hear them. It's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. That's why I've called for an immediate ceasefire. An immediate ceasefire to stop the fighting. Bring the hostages home.
Biden did say he was actively working on a way to settle this phase of the conflict, including reiterating his backing for a two-state solution.
An effort was mounted by alumni to rescind their invitation to have Biden speak, but it wasn't successful. Some members in the graduating class did protest, albeit silently, turning their backs as Biden spoke. Others wearing kiffiyeh scarves adorning the Palestinian flag and decorating their caps in solidarity with Gazans. Class valedictorian D'Angelo Jeremiah Fletcher spoke on the plight of Palestinians during his speech at length. Let's take a look.
It is my stance as a Morehouse man, nay, as a human being, to call for an immediate and a permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip.
And notably, social media had a lot to say about this because Joe Biden seemed to be clapping along with his statements that were explicitly critical of the Biden administration's relationship to Israel as Israel is conducting this siege on Gaza. And there was speculation as to whether or not he was clapping because he agreed, which doesn't seem
to make sense.
Right. Or if he was confused, and if this kind of goes to people's frustration or worries about his cognitive fitness.
Right, and the specifics of that call, which was, I think, for a long-lasting or permanent ceasefire. Now, so far, the president has sort of perhaps very vaguely suggested, yes, it would be good if there's no fighting, but the impetus has always been toward a more temporary ceasefire. And before we even got to that point, there was the United States vetoing thrice in the United Nations demands for a ceasefire. So was he kind of swept up in the moment? Did he want to show his support for the valedictorian? Maybe, but the valedictorian was not articulating a Biden position.
Right.
So it all gets a little complicated. One of the other interesting sort of visuals, and you mentioned social media, Brie, I'm sure you saw the same imagery that I did, where when the president first either took the stage or went to the lectern, you had alumni and give him a standing ovation, and it seemed like the entire graduating class stay seated. And you could hardly have wanted a better illustration of the way age or age group is a fault line in this whole debate about the conflict.
Absolutely, and it's worth noting, I think this is underreported, that there were concerns on campus leading up to Biden's address, a kind of an understanding that there was pushback from the student body, so much so that the Biden administration sent an emissary to try to allay those concerns and talk to student groups to try to minimize how much disruption there was during the actual ceremony. And Morehouse president David Thomas basically told the students that he wasn't going to stand for any kind of more active disruption, that they would allow silent, non-disruptive protests, but that he would shut down commencement ceremonies, quote, on the spot if there were any big disruptions preventing attendees' ability to partake and enjoy. So students were on notice that the whole ceremony would come to a halt if there were anything other than the silent kind of protest, the flag holding, the back turning, the failure to stand up that they engaged in. So given that was the case, it is interesting to me how there did seem to be a framing from some quarters that this went off without a hitch, this wasn't very disruptive, there was no problems here, that was overblown, when the students seemed to be kind of acting within the confines of what they were told and doing the most that they could do without having the entire ceremony shut down. But also, what would it have meant? Would President Thomas have called his own bluff? Would the students have called his bluff rather?
Right.
would they have shut down the ceremony and said the president should just walk away? I mean, it is an interesting tension that is set up by saying these are the parameters for protest, and what does it mean for the students to have gone up to that line but not gone over it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, the issue of how the level of protest is framed is a very important one. Now, I do think the White House and the people around Biden were probably relieved that there was not a more demonstrative or spectacular protest, right? It did stay within the confines of peaceful protest. Biden, during his speech, said that he supports peaceful protest and all of that. I am curious, though, Bree, I mean, given you're someone whose views on this conflict are pretty well known, and he's speaking at an HBCU that is Martin Luther King's alma mater, were you disappointed that there was not a more demonstrative protest?
I mean, I don't know. I think that students are in a really tough position. I think that they did, frankly, as much as what has been done at other colleges. What's been frustrating to me is to see the exact same actions taken here that have been taken at other graduation ceremonies characterized as not a protest at an HBCU, but we characterize it as, there was a walkout at Seinfeld, or it's the students are sort of all engaging in the same kind of behavior. And this behavior, by the way, is why Joe Biden stopped going to visit colleges back in January, because they realized that he couldn't get through remarks without getting shouted down. And it does seem like there was a lot of basically crowd control that happened at Morehouse, where the students were talked to and pressured into not doing more. There's also worth noting that there's a certain culture at Morehouse in particular of having a sort of maturity, what it means to be a Morehouse man. That it doesn't surprise me that there's more of a reluctance to engage in sort of kind of a hysterical spectacle that you might see in other kinds of environments where people don't see themselves quite as representative of the race and the talented 10th and the best of the best. There's a lot of like internal cultural politics that I also think are mediating how the students chose to express themselves. But that being said, the fact that you had the valedictorian wearing his keffiyeh, the fact that you had students holding up the Palestine flag and turning their back to the president, I think that actually speaks louder given the circumstances and the culture at the institution itself that are kind of personally conservative, not politically conservative, but in terms of your personal behavior and how respectable you are, conservative. One other viral and kind of controversial aspect of Biden's remarks was that he reiterated some of the narrative that he's been getting a lot of pushback for in the past, including from his own teams. Remember when he said he saw photos of 40 beheaded babies, something that has been now debunked roundly over and over and over again. He said that repeatedly, despite his team saying, Biden, we told you there's no photos, you didn't see any such thing. At Morehouse's commitment, he claimed he, quote, saw pictures of Hamas tying a mother and daughter in a rope, pouring kerosene on them, burning them, and watching as they died. Again, these are events that have not been substantiated by any physical evidence. And it is interesting that he seemed to evoke that kind of imagery as he was framing the protests, right? Saying, yes, I believe in peaceful protests and college protests, but remember, this is what really happened. And I think it speaks to the kind of asymmetry of violence that we've now seen, that he does seem to feel compelled to evoke tragedies that didn't happen, instead of just staying with the tragedies that did happen, perhaps in part to create to amplify the moral weight on the Israeli violence side, now that there is so much weight on the violence against Palestinian side of this equation.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that the way that is characterized is peculiar because he has been told previously, as I understand it, that these photographs he's citing, the White House has previously clarified, no, he did not see any such photos. He is dependent upon, or is basing that upon, the version of events given to him by Israeli officials.
And one other point, you raised this earlier, that it's ironic for Biden to be saying, I support a two-state solution, I support a ceasefire, when his actions, or the actions of his representatives at the UN, have been to the contrary. It's not just that America has vetoed these ceasefire resolutions, it's that it's also vetoed recently recognizing Palestine as a state, which is a first step toward a two-state solution. Not to mention, obviously, all of Netanyahu and his government's statements to the contrary of pursuing a two-state solution. So I do think that rung kind of empty and hollow. And I think it is anticipating those kind of statements from Joe Biden that made so many students hesitant about him coming, why use our university as a platform to continue to spread this sort of misinformation that's being used to justify these atrocities? All right, stick around. More Rising coming up next.